Okay, so we're just going to go through a couple of these definitions to get everyone on the same page. The first thing that comes up is a class of individuals having common attributes designated by a common name, which is really, I think, the most basic definition. But the questions that come to mind are which attributes and how common. And it seems like you could kind of self-interpret as needed. The next thing that came up is that species means specifically the human race, which kind of tickled me because of how human-centric it is. But it's kind of besides the point of the discussion that we're having. And then the next one that came up was the one that stuck with me from my like high school biology, which is that things are the same species if they're capable of producing offspring. The way I learned it, it has to be fertile offspring. So that makes sense to me in a lot of contexts, like when you're talking about many kinds of animals, but I also study bacteria, and then I think it makes absolutely no sense. And we all like to think about kelp a lot, and we can talk about whether it makes sense in that context too, because we see a lot of kelp hybrids in recent literature. And yeah, so that's basically it. I was curious if anyone else had definitions that came to mind that we could add on a list here. But if not, that's okay. We can just move on. Okay, so yeah, Siobhan.
I also have a question. Does anybody know where this kind of classification comes from? Like if we're talking about species and order and genus and stuff, does anybody have any ideas? It's okay if you don't, just like when in time or history.
That's a that's a super good question. I I have somewhat of an answer, but it looked like Jess raised her hand.
Well, for me, like the name Linnaeus is coming to mind from undergrad courses that I took, but I don't know what time-ish that was. But I know that he was a classification man.
Emma, do you want to add
I
anything?
was I was thinking of like recent modern history, like the classification of fish, like when new species of fish were discovered, that really terrible man from Stanford University whose name I can't even remember, which I feel glad to not remember. But how he classified all these fish and kind of grouped them in this like larger category of fish, but even just to think about fish as a category of species is so nonsensical because they're a fish that could have more in common with terrestrial animals than other fish themselves. So just thinking of relations and how we've kind of limited those relations. So I'm thinking like more of a modern context, but like going really far back, like when would it be important to make a distinction between us and other? And I feel like that distinction wasn't always made. So like earlier perceptions of nature, I think were very, very different than what we have in our contemporary conception of it.
So my understanding, which could be off, so please folks can always correct, or if they have a different thought, is that, this current system that we tend to use does come from Linnaeus, like Jess is saying, and I saw Oriana nodding as well, right? So that made me feel better. So I was like, yeah. And that was sort of the late 18th century, which was sort of, getting into sort of around, you have the Enlightenment age is happening, and you have some sort of really interesting real explosion in sort of science that's being done in terms of Western science, right? So you have a bunch of, um, probably wealthier Western men going around and wanting to describe the world and classify the world. And so thinking about, I think it's important to think about this things Emma was bringing up too, but it's like, what was the mindset of people of that time who were doing these actions, right? And so not necessarily, I think, I don't know, I try really hard, I'm not going to try and judge what they were doing, right? Because it was a different time and Lord knows what I would have done then, right? Well, I certainly know what I wouldn't have been doing. It's science. But I would have been like picking potatoes. But this sort of idea of a hierarchical classification system was also like something that Linnaeus put in too, right? That you were going to order things in some sort of hierarchy. And this hierarchical ordering system wasn't necessarily saying like, oh, one thing was more than another or something, but it was implying that there is some sort of hierarchical organization in nature that people wanted to place things into. So it's sort of this organizational system that was developed by people who had, I think it's kind of interesting around that time is also when you get a real rise in these, if you look at the history stuff, it's not that everybody thought that humans were the center of the world. Even in the Western scientist tradition that's sort of exploding at that time, there was a lot of debate about this, but definitely there was, that's the narrative that became dominant, that we are this anthropocentric, like we are the center of the world. And that we are the center of ecology as well, which has sort of had all kinds of implications. But yeah, so yeah, talking about things in terms of species, genus, order, phylum, like these types of classification systems was really, something that people only started doing starting in sort of the late 18th century. So it's not that old that we've been doing it in terms of how long human beings have been alive, let alone how long other organisms have been alive. But yeah, that was just me being like, oh, where does this come from? Because that's the kind of stuff I ask myself. I'm like, why do we call these things these things? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it helps to know where they come from to decide whether you want to subscribe to them or not. Right. But yeah, okay, so moving on a little. Siobhan, I know that you have a couple projects in the lab that I hear about a lot, but other people don't. So you're working on like a sargassum phylogeny project with Dean, who's also in the group right now. And then a fossil project. Those are related. They're the same thing, different things. But I was wondering if you could say some about that and about how what we're thinking about as species affect the way that you're going about those projects.
Oh, I can try.
Yeah.
So I think maybe it's important, I'll give just a little context of sort of background, is I would say, whatever it means to say this, my classical sort of discipline or training, I guess, would be in developmental biology and sort of morphology stuff. And so most of the time, when I'm asking questions scientifically, they tend to have that bent. It's like, what is the shape of something? What, is there a purpose to that shape or not? And then where does that come from? And I think that becomes, the way that I've been taught to think about that classically is that, different species potentially look different from each other. And so I'm coming at it from this like idea that there might be morphological differences between species that are interesting in terms of how they've evolved and how they function, potentially not. But this idea that I guess is sort of rooted in classical morphology too, which would have been when, Linnaeus and the other bros were going around trying to classify everything. They did a lot of that based on morphology. So it's like, these things look like these things. They'd be like, they look alike, so they must be related. And so I guess the sort of project that Jess is asking me to sort of speak to is this idea of looking at sargassums, which, I think not everybody will know, but most people might know. So the Sargassiaceae, I'm going to use all these terms, but like the Sargassiaceae in general is, that includes a species that we call sargassums. There's around like 500 and something species in that group. And then the sargassum species themselves, there's maybe like 350 potential species. But I think what's interesting for me about it is that there's an adorable child outside. I'm sorry, I just got distracted. Okay. What's interesting for me is that it's definitely, this is happening in all algae and brown algae in particular, but also reds and everything. It's like all of these things and what people thought were species and what they classified based on morphology, a lot of that is just up in the air all the time.
And I think that's really cool. And I think it gives us a fertile space to think about things, but also think about this idea of, is form something that's related to evolution? Do you have form popping up multiple times as opposed to it just evolving once and then sticking? And there are ways within which understanding how things are related to each other is useful for me, I guess, when I'm thinking about those questions of form and where it comes from. But you can also see where, like, both historically and even myself, like, I fall into a trap of thinking, because this looks like something, it must be related to this thing. And I think there are ways within which that's true and ways within which that isn't true. So taking that for granted is problematic, I guess. But
The sargassums in general, I mean, they're fascinating because they're so plastic in some way. Like they look different in different places, and people still call them different, still based on morphology, but whether or not they are is another question. So as people are using, DNA-based evidence to define species, which is something we can talk about, we're seeing things where what they used to think were, say, 30 different species that were in the Philippines, in fact, probably maybe now they're going to define as actually only 3 species. And it's like, wow, that's a serious reduction, and gets us to these questions of, like, what makes a species? Is it, if you have one nucleotide different, are you a different in one gene? Are you a different species? If you have one trait different, are you a different species? Or do you have to live in a different environment? Or I don't know. I think for me, there's ways within which it's useful. Sometimes because it gets us money to talk about it, honestly. But there's also ways within which I think it can constrain thinking. Like, we think this is a species, well, and that means it's separate from this other thing. But what if it isn't? What if we just decided that as humans who have to put things in boxes? So I don't know if that's helpful, or if anybody has any thoughts they want to add in, questions about it, because I haven't been in details. Emma.
I will totally jump in here because I'm excited. I'm like at the edge of my seat, like, oh yes, she's saying all the things that are popping up in my head right now. Yeah, with DNA sequencing and figuring out family lines a lot more closely and being able to see where things diverge. So I immediately think of octopus and the last time that our common ancestors diverged, which was millions of years ago. And like, I mean, I think it's interesting that probably the closest thing that we can compare to like our common ancestry is like a worm or something. But it's just this idea of like how, like, I mean, take humans, for example. AKA humans, we call ourselves humans, right? But what other ways could we classify and distinguish ourselves? So I was joking with kelp, with Jess. I was like, well, maybe I'm just kelp because I spend so much time with kelp. But it's also all the bacteria, right? So the microbiome inside of us, it's everything and every organism that functions with us. So could we exist as a species alone without those organisms? And then does that complicate our understanding of a species? So mycorrhizal networks and trees, for example, or soil and trees, like these things that we would traditionally classify, even just between living and non-living, might complicate our understanding in what a species is. And so to throw like a wrench and everything, just thinking about where those confines and limits are, philosophically speaking. So like trying to adopt phenomenological thinking, like what makes the environment around us different from our container or our body. Even just getting as abstract as that might help to kind of loosen up this idea of species or our traditional way of thinking of it, to rethink it, I suppose. And so I guess the question I throw back out is, if a species can't exist without another mineral or another organism, is it its own species?
To me, what I hear there is sort of a question that relates to a principle that comes up in Western science a lot, not only Western science, but a lot of other things, of like individualism, right? Like, you need to say this thing as a complete individual unit. And I need to be able to enclose it in this sterile little clean box and say, this is Pelagophycus pora, right? Like, that is what that is. And that is a single thing that exists. And I think the way you put it as like a philosophical question is really interesting for me, because, some of the roots of that we have records of, right? And a lot of this has to do with when people really started recording things in written word. And that's problematic in a way. So we can really only, what oral histories we still have access to are fewer and fewer because of the dominance of the written word. But anyway, like if you look back at sort of Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, who are starting to think about like, well, what is life? You know, they were like, well, that's where we get this idea of life, and a thing that is alive is a thing that reproduces itself. Like that's one of the major parts of that definition that we kind of accept for granted now, but like, is that actually a useful definition? So should a species be able to reproduce itself, right? Like, is that an individual unit? Is that a trait that we think is important? Obviously, it's a trait we think is important for living things, whether it's real or not, but like there are species that can't reproduce themselves. They need to outcross, right? Like they need to get gametes from something else. So would that no longer be considered a species? Because yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if this is helpful. I don't know if other people have thoughts.
I have some thoughts.
Siobhan,
Yes. Emma, what you were kind of throwing out, I think, is kind of talked a lot about in the holobiont literature, where they argue that like this is like something that I think started with corals, that the coral and the sponges too, that's a really common thing in the sponge world, is like it's not just the host, it's also the microbes. And I think kind of what a lot of people are saying is like taxonomy is like a convenient box to talk about things, but as we stretch the case, it always breaks down regardless of like what box you pick. And the issue with the holobiont concept, which has like, I mean, the unique downfalls of that one, I'm not saying it's like a bad way to think about it, but for the holobiont specifically, it's like if we think of humans, the gut microbiome changes throughout the life and also like what you eat. So like with the strict definition, it would make like humans, as we think about them now, being different species depending where they live, which is both interesting and also I think everyone can kind of see how that would lead to problems with how humans are. So yeah, it's something that other people have like thought about and written about a lot. Yeah, it has its advantages and disadvantages.
Can I add to this, because now I'm really excited. But what if we didn't call ourselves humans, period?
I think there probably is a paper that's kind of gone over that. I'll see if I can find it.
Yeah,
But
please do and share, because that's where my thinking is, because humans themselves is a categorization, right? Humans are a categorization. So trying to differentiate humans it's just as complicated to me as differentiating species, but maybe not to other people. I think it's just an area of complexity in which it's exciting to play with the idea of it. And of course, there's utility in categorizing things, and it makes it easier to contain that which we study, and to have limitations so that we don't go off the rails. So this conversation has been my invitation to go off the rails, clearly, with this concept of what a human is. Yeah, totally share that paper if you find it, because I think there's something worth thinking about language and our connection to understanding our body, even just between our mind and our body and the other microbiome or whatever else that we live around. I think there's a complexity to it that is difficult to pinpoint. I see Dean's raising his hand.
Yeah,
Dean?
I immediately I'm paleo. I do lots of paleo stuff, so I immediately like if you look it gets even complicated. I'm doing the whole human thing too. Like it gets even complicated looking back at the fossil record because there are so many, individuals that are not classified as Homo sapiens, but they're often referred to as early humans. And humans themselves have we have a significant number of people have some DNA from Neanderthals. So like most people don't think of Neanderthals as humans, but like that distinction really is just like it doesn't really exist. It's interesting for me because I feel like people will say like modern humans in reference to like the ones who survived, but like I mean, I don't know. It just there's a lot of things to think about. I think about this often when it comes to categorizing humans as a species when you look at other um species in the fossil record, and they they probably lived like or early Homo sapiens did. Like the distinction probably isn't as there as a lot of people think about or think. Yeah.
I love that. I love it because it's like forcing me to think about our continual evolution. Like it seems to me a lot of the times that we've landed on human, Homo sapien, there we are. But what might we be in 1,000 years from now if the climate change doesn't go downhill from here? So I think that's really awesome to think about. And it makes me also think about Donna Haraway and cyborg futures as well, which becomes gets into this different realm. I see Siobhan nodding her head.
I was so yes, because I like stuff, but then I was also thinking like it reminded me, I started chuckling because we were working on a grant for NASA recently. It's a seaweed related thing. And I just kept writing that like, oh, one potential thing is like if you can grow seaweeds in space, like it'd be great. They'd be animal food, and that's important. And like everybody else I was writing with was like, I think you might have to say humans. Like you can't just keep calling humans animals. And I'm like, but they are animals. And I recognize like that's a categorization, right? Like I think there is some scientific basis to some of these categorizations. But I mean, I know what you're doing, Emma, is like trying to get us to think like, well, where did that come from even, right? It's all these layers of an onion. But it's interesting for me because I tend to think of humans as being animals, because to me we are, and that we're not that, like we're really, to me, we're not that different from other animals that live on this earth. And that I think infers a lot of ways that I live my life and stuff as well. But I don't know, I want to go back to this thing. I think Jesse started us off too by thinking, okay, here's some definitions, but also this acknowledgement that this is something that may be useful. It may not be useful, but that at least being aware of that and asking these questions is an important thing to maybe try and think about, right? Like, if it is a human construct, which is also, I think, what everybody's been implying, it's like if we as humans are as we as human animals, I don't know, are deciding with our brains that we need to categorize these things. And the way, Siobhan was talking about, well, a holobiont can change over a lifetime and during time. So where do we set those boundaries? Who decides what those boundaries should be? And are they doing that because there's a utility to it? Is it an acknowledged utility, or is it just because it's what we're used to doing? And I think those are sort of some of the things that might be useful. They're useful for me to think about too. It's like, well, I mean, we do this thing in the lab if we're working on Stephanus cystis, which is a Sargassiaceae here in California that we think is cool. And it's like, I'm just always remind myself, I'm like, Stephanus cystis doesn't care what I call it. Like, really doesn't. That's me and my mental organization being overlaid over top. But there are ways within which it can be helpful for like restoration, right? So if we're thinking about species that we're thinking about organisms, let's call it that we want to preserve or protect from anthropogenic effects, right? Then how do we decide if we can't save everything? We have to prioritize saving some things. We can't save every single individual that exists, so then we would choose representatives from populations. So then we have to decide, well, which populations? And people oftentimes are like, I want to sample this species from different geographic areas, right? But I think so there's a way within which I can say, okay, working on Pelagophycus pora, let's say, you're like, well, we want to make sure that we don't lose all this biodiversity that we have here on our coast with upcoming climate change. So we better sample a bunch of Pelagophycus from up and down the coast and make sure we're sort of keeping those gametophytes in a seed bank, right? But if we couldn't call it, I guess, yeah, if we couldn't call it Pelagiophycus and define it in that way, is it necessary to have that definition of it as a single species in order to preserve it? That's sort of where I'm getting at while I'm thinking on the fly. And I don't know.
And that reminds me of, I mean, so in our lab, we've talked about seaweed reproduction a lot. And so like seaweed sex comes up, and you have male gametes and female gametes, is what a lot of people call them. We've decided to use different terms to avoid like gendered thinking affecting our science. But when I was thinking about it originally, I was like, of course they needed to call them something just so that they could talk about it with each other. And so, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the time, what I end up feeling is that ultimately these categorizations can be damaging if you latch onto them too hard, but they are necessary, especially at the beginning of discovering something, of noticing something, just in order to talk about it with other people and communicate what you're thinking about. Yeah.
This is gonna throw things for a tangent. I feel like I'm just playing the devil's advocate this whole entire time.
Do
But
it, Emma.
I was listening to this podcast. There's this great podcast series by the Santa Fe Research Institute called Complexity. And they were talking about two different types of people. So this is a categorization, I know, but it gets to a point. Talking about the explorers and the extractors. And that when we're children, we're all exploring. We're like trying to figure out what things are. And one of our innate ways of interacting with the world is putting things in our mouth. So whether it's a toy or food, or you find out it's not food because you put it in your mouth and you realize it's something icky like deodorant or something else that you didn't mean to put in your mouth, you're constantly assessing the environment and figuring out your relationship to it. And then it gets to a point where a lot of people grow into the extractive kind of way of thinking. You might be in business or finance or something that's very directed, something that it serves to get information out of something. And a lot of our society is built in this kind of extractive modality. But then there's like artists and scientists that are just not quite done exploring and might have two patterns. There might be the exploring and the extracting. So like writing grants and then going out and actually like interacting with the species and being with it and going through records or fossils, or if you're a paleontologist or a scientist in the lab and you're exploring. But so what I'm getting at is like, I love how Siobhan is describing, do we need to know Pelagiophycus? Do we need to know Pelagiophycus pora in order to know it? Like, do we have to have a name for it in order to talk about it and to know it? And I think it's interesting because I find, and this might just be me personally, and I'm kind of curious what everyone else thinks, but I find that when I have a name for something, I feel that I know it falsely. I'm like, oh, it's Pelagiophycus pora. But now when I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about it, I'm like, oh man, like, okay, what do I know about it though? Like, what do I know about it in terms of its relationship to humans? It grows maybe in like 90+ feet water. Okay, what else do I know about it? I don't know the microbiome that's living on it. Jess, help me out here. Like, what bacteria is growing on the Pelagiophycus? And suddenly all of those relationships are unknown. But if you like take a child who has no idea what something is, they're gonna like start from point A and try to work their way up in terms of like, can I eat it? How long is it? Can it fit in my hand? How do I interact with it? So that's where my mind went with this. And I feel that I went really far off a tangent, but I see Dean raising his hand again.
Yeah. It's interesting when you give things names, because in paleospace, especially with vertebrate paleontology, with dinosaurs especially, things get people are always trying to name different things and off of really like tiny bits of material, and you experience it enough and you grow frustrated with it enough that you kind of start thinking about like, what does naming something even matter? um I'm actually a proponent of like most vertebrate fossils should just stay at this like genus level. We don't really need more than one species for, especially for particularly old things. And I end up kind of moving into a space personally where I feel like knowing a name is really like knowing a node in a series of relationships. Like that's how I've started to think of uh species, is that they're defined, they have their own traits, but I found it more useful for myself to like how does this group of individuals relate to its environment? How does it relate to other organisms? How are those relationships, changed over time? And I feel like those are far more important to me than actually giving those things a name, you know? Um, Especially when I've come from a space where giving things names is like, that's it. Like you will name something and people will argue about it and that'll be that. And that's all you do. And it's frustrating. So I think that like moving completely away from, necessarily giving something a very precise um putting something in a very precise box, as long as you can figure out relations like within like how that thing relates to its space, I feel like that's far more important to me personally. um but I feel like that's a very fairly I don't know, controversial way of thinking about these things.
I see where you're at.
Yeah.
I can't figure out how to raise my hand virtually today. Sorry, but all of this has got me thinking about something that I experienced recently on a trip. I was in a really rural area and like a mangrove swampy area. And when my way of relating to other people is like, look at that weird thing. And there were these really cool tiny, tiny crabs that were coming out of the mud in the mangroves that were like, maybe their bodies were like an inch long, and some of them had only one claw that was enormous. It was bigger than the rest of their body, and their other claw was little, and their big claw was either red or yellow. And I was like, these are amazing crabs. What are they called? And nobody could tell me their name. And eventually somebody in the village was like, they're too small to have a name. I was like, that was a fascinating concept, because earlier that day, somebody had come by with like a big mud crab. They told me it was a mud crab that was headed to the fish market. And so for them, there was this really clear distinction, like things that are tiny and like don't have a relationship to their community, just they didn't have names. And the things that mattered to them had names. And it was I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about that kind of outside of what I had been taught of this Linnaean, you have to put everything in a box and figure out how they're related to each other. But this was like a totally different way of delineating what had names and didn't. And I left feeling kind of disappointed that my funny crab with the giant arm didn't have a name to them. But I didn't, not disappointed enough to go figure out what the name of that crab was, because I'm sure it has a name. And I just wanted to share that little bit with you guys, because it was something in kind of out in the world that made me think about this stuff a little bit differently. Not kelp related, unfortunately. Sorry.
No, it reminds me of the fact that if you look at juvenile kelp, they look really similar to each other.
Yeah.
Like where you're out in the field and you're like, what's this? And you're like,
It's a baby.
right now it could be any kelp, right? Like this way that maybe it's like it's either they haven't attained a function yet that requires them a name, like that sounds like one of those reasons, or that we can't even tell them apart, and so they don't have names. They're just kelps.
Baby kelps.
I don't know what kind of kelp it is yet, right? Because it hasn't shown itself to me, maybe. Yeah. It hasn't expressed itself in that way. Yeah. Oh, but this idea of things having names, I think, so Linnaeus and compatriots wanting to go out and like give everything names because they wanted to show this order in the universe and things like this, and how are things related to each other. But the idea that other systems exist and are equally valid, of like a thing has a name that when it's important, when it's part of our linked network, right? And if it isn't, then it's a thing, but it doesn't have a name necessarily. I think that's also a cool concept. And sometimes, I don't know, I'm going back because we've had this before. It's about this idea of communication is one reason. Like we've come up at the lab, Jesse brought this up, and I think Oriana, you know, you're just wanting to know the name of something. It's like, that's also how we communicate with each other. So how do you know that I'm talking about the same thing? And I mean, I think even now in science, you know, when someone is publishing a molecular thing and they're like, this is from Macrocystis, and we're like, well, I mean, it'd be really cool if you had a herbarium print, because then I'd believe you. Instead of like, well, this is what I think it is, right? Like we want more evidence than just even just someone's word, which I think is kind of interesting. So how do I know that what I call Macrocystis and what you call Macrocystis are the same thing? And I mean, even just, you know, when we use the term kelp now, that's changed too, right? Kelp would refer to laminar aeles right now, but it hasn't always. Before it was a broader category. I don't know. Communication, I can see that there's a way within which is helpful. Because imagine I had to describe enough about this thing that you understood what I was talking about instead of just using a name. So I guess it makes it easier, faster to communicate, but you do lose information. Like,
So
yeah.
in addition to communication, though, I feel like there is something else that we get. So Emma, you were talking about how having a name for something sometimes makes you feel like you know it less. And that made me think about so Imani's in this group right now. I don't know if she can say hi, but when Imani and I are tide pooling, like we learned a lot of species identification together in a workshop that Siobhan, Imani, and I did with Kathy Ann Miller. And what we were noticing is that like as we learned, we used to go out in the tide pool and just be like, okay, there's so much red algae. Like there's just a lot of it. It's red algae, that's all. And then as we learned more of the different names for the different red algae, we saw more and more all the kinds that we didn't recognize. So it was like learning the names of things and getting to know them just in that small way helped us realize how much we didn't know still, like how much other there was. And so it's slightly different from the point you were making, Emma, but I do think that like identifying something for yourself helps you see all the other stuff that you're missing, rather than if you just don't classify anything, it can all seem like very lumped together into one group.
Well,
So I think communication, but also like just learning comes from the classification.
I think, yeah, I totally agree with this. I think, I guess where I'm going to is that the classification is not the limitation to learning. Right? So like once you know what something is, that doesn't mean you know how they are or like why they are, which is also like those are incredibly complex questions to answer. And so like where I stand with language and thinking about language is that it's very utilitarian. There's a purpose to it. There's a communication to it. But there's something I think that supersedes that in the way that we interact with the world. And I can't quite put it into words, right? I can't quite put into words how we know things. I think it's a very complex thing to try to understand. But that knowledge generation of those species in the tide pool, like looking at the variation of different red algae and wanting to get to know each one on an individual level. I think that somebody that always comes to mind when I'm thinking about this is Kathy Ann Miller, who I wish we had here today. Because when the few times that I've spoken with her, she like re-taxonomizes things, right? I don't know if that's the proper way of saying it, but she's recreating these family trees with genetic information and being able to say, oh, these are where their ancestors, these are the ancestors. And she has this entire like family mapping of the algae that help to better understand it. And so it's like, I wonder how, like what percentage of people have that kind of in-depth knowledge and background, right? So when you're studying something, where does the limit on getting to know that species start and end? So maybe with Dean, it's very different than with somebody in phycology who's like very specific and oriented in figuring out that family tree. So I'm guessing like in everybody's like it kind of opening it up to anybody, like where does that limit start and end? Maybe there's no answer. No easy answer, at least.
I feel like, so as Jess like introduced in the beginning, just to remind people too, like my disciplinary training would be in botany. And when I was taught botany, it did not include brown algae. Although like that's not true. They taught us some stuff in brown algae and pretended it was plants. But what I think is really interesting is like there was a time within which the botany departments is where the phycology was as well. Like all these things were plants because they all photosynthesized, but that's a different categorization question. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is that I don't think I reached the bottom of knowing anything that I work with, and maybe I never will. So as I experience organisms in different environments or different places around the world or from different kinds of lenses, right? So every student who comes into the lab brings in different lenses by which they view maybe even the same, what we call species that we work on. And that allows me to deepen my knowing of this thing and to learn about it some more. And so it's like I'm always adding information. I'm always adding to the story of this organism that we work with. And sometimes that's adding to the current description of this organism. Sometimes it's like uses that I didn't know about, or like ways within which people eat it that I didn't know about. Sometimes it's looking even deeper in time, like the project with Dean that's thinking about, well, how long have these things existed? And do we think they were the same thing as they are now? Or obviously not, but how, if they look so similar, they could be the same, or so good at what they do that they just don't have to change. Like all these things where I'm like, oh, wow. And I am constantly getting to know things, I guess. So maybe for me, there's no limit on where I know things in like, hopefully the span of my life. But also this idea that I can learn and unlearn things about something, right?
Mhm.
Like that seems important. It's not like so it is neither finite nor always fixed. And that is deeply uncomfortable, I think, as a scientist, somebody who's trained as a Western scientist, because it's like, no. This like, I have evidence and I make a conclusion and like, But like, again, getting attached to something, I think Jesse, you were saying, it's like, the problem is if you get really like, so attached to a name that you can't let it go. I think that attachment is maybe a thing that could be problematic. I don't know. What do other people think? Does your knowledge of an organism that you work with or organisms ever stop? Do you ever feel like you truly know it?
I love it.
Everyone's like, no.
I feel like if you say you know everything about something, you haven't tried hard enough. I feel like to say that you know everything about anything is just like, no, I don't know. It's just like you can, I feel like I have the outlook that you can always learn more about something and be prepared to have what you do know, challenged at a future point. I think you've closed your mind, and that is not something we want to do as scientists to say if we know. Like, I think it just goes against, what science is. If you say with certainty you know everything, um, yeah, it's just I don't know. I don't believe in that stuff.
That's very fair. I'm thinking about something that hasn't come up, but that Jess and I were talking about that felt kind of integral to species, which are salamanders. Jess, do you want to talk about salamanders?
No, I don't remember what we were saying about salamanders.
Well, so salamanders, okay, so in the very beginning, we were talking about the original definitions of species, something that reproduces, right? Something living that reproduces. Well, there's salamander that reproduce with other species, so not their own species. So I think that one really boggles my brain because,
Well, but also,
yeah.
go ahead. I mean, we have like hybrid kelps and brown algae that we're seeing, right? So the this whole thing about like it's the same species if it can produce fertile offspring, it just doesn't work for me in a lot of cases. It works in the donkey horse mule situation. Um, but other than that, like I don't see it being very helpful most of the time. And I got at this a little bit earlier, but like I work in bacteria mostly, and there you definitely don't have some bacteria that can combine to make fertile offspring and others that can't. Like it just is a nonsensical way of talking about it in that case. Um, yeah, so I wonder what they are using for salamanders and if it's just DNA sequence similarity. And I mean, is that what we're mostly using for seaweed right now? Is like DNA sequence similarity or morphology, or is it just like different for the different groups of animals or seaweeds and like who's studying it and determining how it's defined? And does it need to be consistent across these things? Like,
I think that the definition that you showed us, right, which was the last more detailed biological one of like can reproduce and produce fertile offspring. That is a definition of species. It's sometimes called like the biological definition of species, but it is not always like agreed upon either, right? So there are people who are like, well, if these populations geographically would never come into contact with each other, then maybe we should consider them as separate species. Even if I were to take like Saccharina latissima from the Atlantic coast and Macrocystis pyrifera and magically combine them in the lab and then produce an offspring that could be fertile, like that is so artificial that it's not actually helpful. But again,
yeah.
it's a barrier, it's a container that someone is building for a particular reason, right? And I guess I think about how, again, we get back to this idea of things being on continuums and not really fitting neatly into boxes. And that's both in time, in a lifetime of an organism. But if you thought about sort of population evolution, right? And you think about this on a whole, you're like, let's say we've got this population of things that are all mixing genetics with each other. This is a very genetic understanding of things, but they're mixing genes because they can cross with each other and produce fertile offspring. So you've got a lot of mixture of genetic material. And then something happens that this population gets split somehow physically from each other. And now they're really just mixing with each other. And as you have accumulation of mutations over time, this is the basis of how most people think of molecular evolution now. It's like you get all these different mutations that are happening, and there'll be different mutations that persist in the populations differently. And at some point, you might have enough, or you might have the right mutation that now means that if I bring them back together, they couldn't mix anymore. There's either enough mutation that's accumulated that like the chromosome aligning isn't going to happen, and so you'll get just shit that happens during reproduction, or you get the right mutation that means they're no longer incompatible, they're compatible sexually. So like there's so many ways within which you could evolve an inability to reproduce, but that takes time and that can be flexible. Yeah, I don't know. This thing of, I do think there are ways within which we want to know if things are related to each other. Like that's useful to me, but is it useful to like to call them a species? Or is it enough to just look at a tree and I can see how related things are? Your question about the seaweeds, it's a combination now usually of DNA and morphology that people use. So I see Dean's hand.
Yeah, when I learned the definition of species, I always learn it like can reproduce like without other organisms involved. Usually people will tack that on to get rid of viruses. But then I'm like, a tapeworm, like that's a definition of life, right? But like it gets into like weird stuff like a tapeworm, that's alive, you know? So like where does this whole I think the reproduction thing is really, really weird because like Like how did I feel like tapeworms I feel like are like the example I think of with this for some reason. Like if you take a tapeworm out of an animal that it reproduces in and can't reproduce, like no matter how many tapeworms are around, are those tapeworms, a species after you have removed it from that? It's really, I think about this a lot with parasites and stuff like that.
And this is reminding me, I mean, Emma sent me something yesterday that was talking about like whether a species exists without the environment that it's in, right? I don't know if you
Yeah.
want to say more about that, Emma.
No, that's exactly what Dean is bringing up, is that idea that and that is it kind of goes back to the holobiont, but now it's like it's kind of almost now we're like in this parasitic relationship situation where it's like that thing truly could not exist without the body in which it inhabits. So, and if they're in the same body, are they together?
Okay. I wish we could talk forever, but we are out of time.
It's true.
That was the hour.
Let me hit pause on this recording.